Hello and welcome to this how-to video on getting started with Trackable Entities and Windows Communication Foundation. You can find step-by-step instructions for this tutorial by going to the Trackable Entities documentation homepage, which you can find at tonysneed.github.io/trackable-entities. From there, simply click on the Getting Started link and scroll down. This one we're going to be focusing on Windows Communication Foundation. And here you'll find step-by-step instructions for getting started with Trackable Entities by using Windows Communication Foundation. You can create a new Windows Communication Foundation application using Trackable Entities by creating a new project where you'll find a Trackable category. Simply select the Trackable WCF Service application. At this point, you'll be presented with an option for selecting the kind of entities you'd like to generate for your WCF application. Here you can either choose separate client and service entities, or you can select the option to share a single entities project between client and service. Which of these you choose is simply a matter of personal preference and how much separation you'd like to have between your client and service. The option for shared entities is going to require less maintenance on your part because you're only going to have to generate a single set of entities that are shared between your client and your service. For the purposes of this tutorial, we're going to choose the first option, which is to generate separate entities for client and service. If you know that both your service and client are both going to be based on .NET 4.5 or greater, you can select the first option. Otherwise, you can choose the option to create portable entities for your client. The Visual Studio template will create a multi-project solution that contains a README file with step-by-step instructions for creating a Windows Communication Foundation service using Trackable Entities. Your WCF service will be located in your core project, which is going to be hosted in a web host. One of the first things you're going to want to do is to update the NuGet packages for your solution. You can do that by right-clicking on your solution and selecting Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. So we'll start out by updating the Client Trackable Entities packages. Then you're going to want to update the Trackable Entities for EF6 packages. Then we're going to start by creating service entities for our WCF service to use. And to do this, we're going to use the Entity Framework 6.x tools for Visual Studio. And to do that, we're going to add a new item to our Service Entities project. From here, select the Data tab and choose ADO.NET Entity Data Model. We're going to call this Northwind Slim. You can either select EF Designer from Database, or you can select Code First from Database. Although Trackable Entities does support Designer from Database, it's recommended that you choose Code First from Database because EDMX files will be deprecated in a future version of Entity Framework. Here we're going to select or create a data connection. We're going to be using SQL Express and select the Northwind Slim database. We'll accept these defaults and we'll indicate that we want to import all of the tables. The wizard will generate a class that inherits from DB context, and it will also generate entities for you. For WCF projects, it's important that the namespaces for the entities match between client and service. Because we're going to use the Entity Framework Power Tools on the client, we're going to want to move the classes created for the service into the Models folder in the project and to adjust the namespace accordingly. Next, you're going to generate entities for the client using the Entity Framework Power Tools. And the reason we're using the power tools on the client is because they are compatible with portable class libraries. And the EF power tools will generate entities for all the tables in the database. Once the entities have been generated, you can delete the context class as well as the mapping classes, which are not needed by the Client Entities project. Notice that the entity classes have been placed inside of a models folder, and that the namespace in the client matches the namespace for our entities on the service. At this point, you're going to want to copy the database connection string from the app config file in your service entities project, and you're going to want to paste it into the web config file of your web project. At this point, make sure that you build your solution, and then you'll be ready to add a WCF service type to your core project. To do that, you're going to add a new item to the core project. You're going to select the Trackable category, and underneath that, the WCF subcategory. There you'll find a Trackable WCF service type template. In this example, we're going to start out with the customer type, so we're going to create a customer service class. Next, you're going to select the entity name from the list of available entities in your referenced entities project. You're going to type an entity set name, which is the plural form of the entity. Within this single file, you're going to find both a service contract interface as well as a WCF service type which implements this interface. One of the things you're going to need to do is make sure that the data type of your parameters matches the primary key data type in your table. We can do that by simply doing a search replace of int for string. One other thing to keep in mind is that our entities are free of the data contract and data member types, which means we have to configure the data contract serializer in order to preserve object references. For this purpose, we're using a WCF serialization helper package, which contains an attribute called data contract serializer preserve references. Next, we're going to add a WCF service type for the order entity. We'll call this order service. We're also going to want to add an additional method here called getOrdersByCustomerID. We're going to want to add that method to the order service WCF type, which implements iOrderService. And here we'll simply filter our list with a where clause. Finally, notice there are to-do items for include operators. And we'll make sure to do that in each of our get methods. And lastly, while we're here, we can scroll down to simply have a look at the create, update, and delete methods. You'll notice that for create, we're setting the state to added and calling apply changes. Update has a similar look to it. We're simply calling apply changes to apply all the inserts, updates, and deletes. Lastly, delete order requires that we include child entities. So we're going to want to specify an include operator that brings in the order details. If you expand the web project, you'll notice an example service SVC. We can rename this to customer service SVC. And then when we open it, we can also rename the service type from example to customer service. And lastly, we can copy and paste this SVC file to have one for our order service. After doing this, we should be able to browse to each of these to make sure the service comes up correctly with the metadata exposed. And the one thing you want to make note of here is the port number used by our service host. If you open up the console client in the Solution Explorer, you'll find an iExample service C# class representing the client version of the service contract. We can rename this from iExample service to iCustomer service. First, we're going to replace the entity name. And secondly, we're going to switch from an int parameter to string. And finally, don't forget to rename iExampleService to iCustomerService. Next, you're going to want to copy and paste the iCustomerService C# file and rename it iOrderService. We're going to change the primary key back to int from string. And we're going to insert an additional method here to get orders by customer ID. And then we're going to want to uncomment the endpoint from app-config on the client. Here we're going to replace example with customer, both in the address and the contract, as well as the name of the endpoint. After that, we can create a new endpoint for the order service. Then we'll uncomment code in main, which creates channel factories for our service. And notice here we're passing in the name of the respective endpoints in app.config in order to create a channel for each of those services. Now we should be able to press Ctrl F5 in order to launch our client. And you'll notice we get an error here indicating that we've exceeded the maximum message size. So we can correct that by adding an entry in the app.config file on the client. To do that, we'll insert into the system.serviceModel section a bindings element to indicate that we want to set the binding max received message size and max buffer size to their maximum values. We can now run this again, and this time we receive all the customers from the Northwind Slim database. Finally, we're going to uncomment code in our console client that creates a new order, then updates the order, and finally deletes the order that we created. In this line of code, we're going to be creating a new order from scratch, along with the details. One thing to notice here is that we are not actually creating any related entities. We're simply specifying the customer ID for an existing customer, as well as a product ID for existing products. And now we're going to press enter in order to create a new order for the customer ELF key. Now that we've created a new order, we can start change tracking on that order by passing it to a new change tracking collection of order. Next, we're going to want to call the getChanges method of the change tracker. And what this will do is give us only the entities that have been inserted, updated, or modified. Next, we're going to step into the service in order to update this order. So we'll set a breakpoint in order to land back here. Here you can see we've broken into the update order WCF service. Once we've done that, we can call save changes. This will actually persist all of the updates within a single transaction. After doing so, we're going to want to call this method called loadRelatedEntities in order to populate the entities which were not passed in to our update order service. Lastly, we'll call acceptChanges, which simply sets the tracking state back to unchanged and return the entity back to the client so that all of the database generated values are returned to the client. Now we've returned from our update order method in our WCF service, and we're ready to merge the changes that have been updated in the database back into the original object graph that exists on the client. And to do that, we're going to call the mergeChanges method. And you can see here that our updated order includes a modification to the order detail for chai. The Cajun seasoning has been unchanged, Chang has been removed, and aniseed syrup has been added. Lastly, we're going to delete the order that we created at the beginning of this client session. And that concludes this how-to video on getting started with Trackable Entities and Windows Communication Foundation.